Good afternoon. This is Karen Slaughter, and I'm here with Anna Griffiths, and we are both part of the Special Education Administrative Support here at Region 10. You have, hopefully you are viewing the welcome screen, so I just want to let you know there are no handouts in the webinar itself. They are located on the website livebinders.com. We see that in the middle of your screen here. When you go to livebinders.com, if you will search by name, there should be a button in the upper right-hand corner, I'll show you in just a minute, for special education funding, and you'll be able to open that binder. This is the actual web address here under that icon if you have difficulty. But I just wanted to call your attention to two contact pieces, contact information, because these will disappear when we start talking about the information that's in the live binder. So if you have trouble during this webinar, for technical assistance, please contact Kamika Webb, and her number there is 972-348-1546, or if you want to email her, her email address is kamika.webb@region10.org, and she spells her name KHAMEKA.WEBB@region10.org. We are not going to take questions during the webinar. You do have a place where you can enter a question, but we're going to be just going through the webinar, and then I can see those questions afterwards. If you have additional questions, please feel free to contact me, and my contact information is down there at the bottom of your screen as well. I just noticed that my microphone was off, so I'm not sure if you all were hearing that or not, so sorry. The first webinar of the season is always a little difficult to get started, so I will just tell you, you have some contact information at the bottom of your screen there, one for technical assistance during the webinar, that's Kamika Webb, and then for after the webinar, if you have questions, feel free to contact me, and my contact information is down there as well. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to end this screenshot. And I am going to show you, if you are at the Live Binder website, this is their homepage. So right here in the upper right-hand corner is where the search button is. If you click on that, you have search all public binders or search in. I'm going to click down in the second dialog box and make sure that name is selected. You've got several choices there, so do make sure it says or search in and name. And then if you will just type special education funding and either hit enter or hit the little magnifying glass, it should be the only binder that pops up. Let me close some of my browser buttons here. To open the binder, you just have to either click the tab that says open or just click on the icon. And this is a collaborative effort between Regions 4, 10, 13, and 20. And this is your state special education funding resource, training resource. So if you were with us, with Anna and I in September, we did a face-to-face training, and we went through revenue and allowable use of funds. Today we're going to go through this budgeting / expenditure tab, and we will not look at all the information in it, but we'll let you see what's in there. A couple of things about how to use the binder. You will see that right now we're on the introduction page, and you see this little caret here that cuts into the tab. So that helps you to know where you are as you move through the tab. The other tabs that we're going to look at today, in particular budgeting and expenditures, there are additional resources, and as you move down the resources, you'll have that little caret. So we're not going to work with revenue or allowable use of funds today, but we will work with budgeting and expenditures. So I'm going to click on that tab now, and there you see how the caret comes into that tab, and there you see that there are several resources in the sub-tab. I do want to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and we will post the recording a few days after today. It has to be posted to our website. It will be on the Region 10 website. It will be on the Special Education Administrative page. There's also a link on the Special Ed Charter page that links you back to the webinar. Excuse us just a minute. We got a little thing here. Let's see if that, yeah. So we have our technical assistance folks are showing us that we are not showing the special ed binder. Now you should get that. So please excuse our technical difficulties. That was totally my fault. So you should be at the www.livebinders.com. And I've highlighted that on your screen. So that's the home page. When you get there, you should go to the search button, which will be over on the right-hand side, and put in special education funding, and you should come up with this binder. It's a little blue type of color. We then clicked on the budgeting and expenditures tab, and that's where we are. So we're going to go ahead and continue. I will tell you that this is being recorded, and it will be posted to the Region 10 Special Administrator Administrative page on the Region 10 website. We're going to touch on these handouts, but we're not going to look at all of them. So the first one I'm going to click on is the Budgeting Quick Reference Guide, and this is a 4-page document, and this kind of lets you see how the binder actually works. So when you click on a sub-tab over here on the left, your document or a link to a document will appear here in the middle. If there's no link in the middle, you see above this window is a link to where you can also get that information. When you hover, as I did, you can see that this is page 1 of a 4-page document. And over to the far right, I can either select the printer icon to print, or I can select the little download button to download. So I'm just going to review with you what is on here. I'm not going to download it, and I will tell you that I have already downloaded the PowerPoints and the handouts that we're going to use. So I will be switching back and forth between what I've already downloaded and this screen to kind of show you where you are. But it takes a while to download, and I just didn't want you all to have to wait for that process. This is a very nice quick reference guide, but as you can see, it's not meant to be your only guide. Some of this information is covered in the first 2 PowerPoints, which is Budget Building Parts 1 through 3 and Budget Building Parts 4 through 7. We are not going to cover those today, but I will probably give you just kind of a summary of the pieces that are in there, and we will start with the Budget Building Parts 8 and 9 today. So one of the things that's covered in that parts 1 through 3 is right here, drafting a budget and how that fits together and how you have to gather resources and so on, prioritize, revise, do a draft and then revise your draft, communicate your budget, pardon me, create a system for reviewing and revising and for auditing. So that process is talked about a little bit in the PowerPoint we'll see today, but also in that first PowerPoint. These are some common abbreviations. Most of you are familiar with them, but in case not, it's nice to have them right here in a short reference. So this is helpful. I'm trying to think what might be. We're going to talk about the FASREG here. It's the Financial Accountability Systems Resource Guide. We'll touch on maintenance of effort next time. We'll talk about PIC codes today a little bit. That's your program intent code. SAAH is your Student Attendance Accounting Handbook. That's a very good resource to have, as well as some of these others. There's some special considerations that you should keep in mind when you are budgeting and watching your budget. And so some of those are the Coordinated Early Intervening Services Funds, or CEIS funds. So I just want to tell you a little bit about that right now. That is for students who have not been identified as special education. you can use up to 15% of your IDEA B formula and or your IDEA preschool, so your federal funds. That would be using that money in an effort to keep students that are currently struggling, to keep them from being later identified as special education students. It's an optional piece unless your district or charter, and I will tell you we use the term LEA, which is Local Education Agency, which includes both your ISDs and your open enrollment charter schools. So if your LEA is deemed to have an issue with significant disproportionality 2 years in a row, then this 15% is mandatory. We're not going to get into that today, but I do want you to be aware that for those of you that have used CEIS funds, or where your LEA has used CEIS funds, what happens is, because you're using money that really is for special education students and for your special education program, when you take up to 15% to use on students that are not special education students, have not been identified, the government wants you to report on how effective the use of that money is, and you would have to report that on that group of students for 3 years, and basically that is through a schedule called the SC 5100. The reason I'm saying this is because the SC 5100 is due to TEA December 1st, and so if you have seen those emails, or that's part of your job description, this is where that's coming from. And basically what that SC 5100 is saying, of these students, how many were identified as special education, and it's in the subsequent 3 years. And that information is in eGrants as well as on the TEA website. Please call me if you have questions about that CEIS schedule, SC 5100. It is due December 1st. It is available in eGrants. And if that's not in your job description, but you know who does do your eGrants applications, you might want to remind them of that, just in case you all did participate in the use of coordinated early intervening service funds. You also have private school. So for those of you that are at charters, you do not do the private school proportionate share piece. That is just for an ISD, and lucky you, Anna and I are the contacts for that. So if you have questions about that, please give us a call. And then there's other things like residential set aside as well. So those are some special considerations when you're looking at your budget. Those are not the only ones by any means, but those are probably the top 3. You also have here on page 2, this is your funding pyramid. And so it talks about the various funding sources, and basically what you want to keep in mind is that your special education block grant right up here at the top, and the very top, your IDEA funds, your federal funds. These are meant to supplement these funds below and not supplant. And we often use the term MOE, maintenance of effort, and we'll discuss that when we go into the fiscal compliance module, which will be the next webinar. So the maintenance of effort is just making sure that you maintain your effort that you spend, your expenditure effort from your state funds from year to year at the same level, if not more. And that shows that you are using your federal funds as supplemental and that you're not replacing or supplanting state funds with federal funds. Speaking of supplement versus supplant, you see that right here in this little yellow box to the right. And then here you have some things here about your state funds, and that you must budget at least 52% of your state funds for direct services. That means direct services for your program. And the remaining amount can be done on these other things that are listed here as well. We covered that in the allowable use of funds in our face-to-face. Another thing you need to keep in mind down here on the bottom of page 2 is partners. You're not in this alone. Your budget, the special education program budget, is intertwined, if you would, with the others, and it's very important that you know your business office people, that you know your PEMS people, that you all coordinate who needs what information, when, and how that's distributed. and just being very transparent and keeping a very nice partnership throughout that. On page 3, you've got your budgeting cycle, so that's always helpful to know when the budget year begins and ends, and so you've got that there. And then you've got a way to project your budgeting funds, a little bit there about maintenance of effort. You have allowables and info. There's a couple of links there. There's some good documents on TEA about allowable and non-allowable and allowable in certain circumstances. And then you've got your available funds down there that are listed in that small yellow box on the bottom of that page. We will talk about coding structure today, so there's a small chart there. You've got a full-blown chart also later that we'll show you. And we will be talking about function code as well as organization code and object code and fund code. So if you look at the chart, I like this because it really explains very briefly what all that means. So your fund code is basically where your money is coming from, whether that is from your Idea B formula or preschool grant, your federal funds, or whether it's from your state and local funds. Function is who you're using, what you're using that for, or who's using it, whether that's instruction or assessment type of thing. Your organization location is where is that being done. So is that something that is across the board, or is it just being used at high school campuses, middle school, elementary? And then your program intent, that's big for us, it's big for all areas, but the program intent designates that this is for your special education program. There are 2 program intent codes that tell us it's special ed, and one is 23. That's for students that are 0 through 21, and then one is 33. That's for our 3 to 5-year-olds. Object code there, second to the last, is what you are buying. So if you're buying something for personnel, paying payroll, then that's going to be 6100s. If it's a contracted service, 6200s, and so on. And they've got some brief information down there below the chart. But if you've ever looked at a budget code and wondered what all those numbers mean, there you go. You also have a fiscal year, what year you're budgeting for, and you'll notice that that's a single digit. That is the last digit of the second year. So for example, we are currently in the school year 2017-18, so our fiscal year would be 8. There's helpful resources here. We've already talked about the Financial Accountability System Resource Guide, or the FASREG. You've got special education funding, state funding, your TEA grants, and you've got some other things there as well. So that's a nice, helpful tool. You might want to download that so that those links are active, and you can use that as a reference tool. So we're not going to discuss, as I said, the first 2 PowerPoints. Let me flip through here. So budgeting parts 1 through 3 really talks to you about what resources you need to gather, and it's gathering those resources so that you can project what your budget would be for the next school year. So you already are in the school year. That's why we're not covering that. That would have been done previously before you applied for your grant. But there are some things I just want to call to your attention with that. Is that some of the things that you would look at would be your PEMS data, current and past years. Also, you would look at your previous year's final expenditure reports. You might look at the student attendance accounting handbook as well and check your attendance, and look to see with your special education population if there's a drastic or significant increase or decrease, not only in the number of students that are going to be served, but also in the severity of their disabilities, any particular special needs that came up. And also, we talked about how your budget is intertwined with the rest of your LEA. You also want to look at your district and campus improvement plans, and if you have any corrective action plans that are things that would have to be addressed through your special education budget and program. You want to take good care to be sure that you are talking to your stakeholders and just making sure that you're checking with everyone that touches the special education program if there's any significant needs, changes, things like that. The other thing that this first part talks about how your federal money comes in. And so You have your tentative amount, which comes in first, and then about this time of the year, October, November, your roll forward or carryover comes in. That's money that was not spent from the previous year, so it comes in. And then later in the year, you have your maximum amount. So you've got them coming in 3 times. We also are not going to touch on this second PowerPoint, which is budget building parts 4 through 7. That talks about looking at making sure that you meet state compliance. So we've talked about Idea B, federal, and we've talked about state. They both have some different compliance pieces. And one of the things with your state is that you must spend up to 52% of that on your program and services for your students. You can spend all of it, but you can't spend less than 52%. So that module, that PowerPoint goes into that a little bit. It also talks about partnering. We've already talked about that, but it gets into that as well with your business office and teams folks, and making sure that everyone is in coordination as to what information you need from each other and when that information comes out and when they need it and where to find it. Also talks about making sure that you have a process in place for adjusting your budget. So if you need to transfer money from one to another, or you need to encumber things, and also watching your expenditures, making sure that those were all allowable and necessary. And looking also just overall monitoring of your budget and any type of adjustment that would need to be made. So with that, we will start on the third part, which is building budgets parts 8 and 9. You would click here to download your PowerPoint. So I will do that for this first one just to show you how the system works. And it comes down as a PowerPoint, and then you would open it. So as I said, I've already done this, but I will go ahead and open this. What's nice about the PowerPoints that are in the live binder is most of them also have notes for you. So that helps if you are reviewing this after the webinar on your own, or if you want to train someone. I'm going to go ahead and put this in PowerPoint mode. Bear with me. And so we're starting here with revisions, amendments, carryover, maximum entitlement, high-cost funds, and residential and others. So when you build your budget, and this is also looking at the eGrants federal grant, when you build your budget and you submit that, if there are changes, you would then do some sort of revision. And these are some of the areas in which you would have a revision. So your grant amendment is when you're asking for TEA to approve a change in the budget that they have already approved. And I just want to clarify that this piece here is talking about your federal funds. So it's talking about your Idea B formula and preschool grant, and it is talking about doing that through the eGrant system. There is a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. There are some times when you can actually adjust your budget and not go through the amendment process per se, as far as actually going into eGrants and changing that. But there are also some things that no matter what the amount or when you do them, they require specific approval. And these are some things here that you would have to do an amendment. So you would have to physically go into eGrants and amend your grant application. For those of you that don't know, I've just realized I've been talking about eGrant. So that is in the TEAS, which is the TEA Secure Environment. And TEAS is also linked to the newer environment, which is the TEAL. So that's the TEA login. It's also a secure environment. You have to have access to TEAS in order to get to the eGrants application, where your special education federal funding, among other federal funds, are located. So If you're moving funds between major object codes, 61 to 6200, you would need to do an amendment. And also, we've talked about those rollover or carryover funds coming in. You would need to do an amendment to accept that money into your e-grants. Or when maximums come in, you would need to also do an amendment to accept that money. When you are doing amendments, for things that do not require specific approval from TEA. And the information about what requires specific approval is in the TEA guidance documents. They're also in e-grants, and they're also on the grant opportunity page on the public side of the TEA website. So as long as you are moving money, and that amount of movements of your money does not exceed 25% of your total budget, you actually don't have to go into e-grants at that time. So you can shift that without filing for amendment unless it is one of those areas that requires specific approval. What some people do is they will, your budget is flexible, and so sometimes they may find the need to move money, not meet that 25%, but then when they go in to do an amendment for, let's say, rollover, carryover, at that point they adjust where they moved money so that their budget in e-grants matches the actual amount. So carryover funds, speaking of, we talked about that. That is money that was not spent from the previous year. Again, we're talking about your federal grant. And it can be rolled over from the previous year to the next, but it must be spent in that next year, or you will lose that. It's called lapsed funds, and that is not a good thing. The other thing to keep in mind, currently with IDEA, there is no maximum amount that you could roll over, so essentially you could roll over your whole budget. However, TEA is watching for large carryover amounts. If an LEA is rolling over a lot of their federal grants, it does send up a red flag, so to speak. It shows that it could be mismanagement of budgeting. It could show that you're not supporting your program. Basically, when you apply for your federal grant, you're telling the agency that you have money through your state special education grant budget, but that you need additional funds. And then when you roll over those additional funds in large amounts, it kind of sends a red flag. So there are some of the federal grants that do not allow carryover, and those are listed at the bottom there, and those are not all LEAs are eligible for that. Those two grants there listed, your DepEd grants. High cost funds. If you have a student who is going to require additional support, monetary support, there is a high cost fund that an LEA can apply for. If they are awarded that, they would go into the e-grants and make an amendment to accept that money. But there are a couple of things that you have to make sure that you meet the criteria for in order to be eligible for the high cost fund. And one of those is that last bullet that we just talked about, that you're not rolling forward a whole lot of your IDEA B funds from the previous year. A whole lot is defined as 60% or more currently. The other thing they look at is that you did not have any lapsed funds. So if you rolled over some money from last year, but you didn't spend it in the current year, that's called lapsed fund. And it is interesting to see you asking for additional funds when you didn't use your funds not only from last year, but you might be rolling over some from this year. So that kind of looks not so good and would probably cause you to not get the high cost funds that may be available. And the other thing as well is that when we are requesting high cost funds, we have to make sure that we have not violated the least restrictive environment for our students or the student that we're requesting those funds for. High cost is currently defined as a child who the expenses are going to be over that $26,055 limit. So if you have one child and you're going to be expending more than that, that would be considered a high cost, and you would have the ability to apply for that extra money. It's called discretionary funds. Please be aware that just because you apply for additional funds and you've got a child that you're going to have very high costs for, and you meet the criteria on the previous slide, please be aware that that does not mean that you will get that amount. What happens is TEA has a bucket, if you want to look at it that way, a certain amount of discretionary funds, and depending on how many folks ask for those high cost funds and how much is in there, will depend on whether those are awarded and the amounts. Those are typically due in October. I think I want to say the deadline was just this past end of October, but I'm not sure. But there is a link there at the bottom of the screen, so if you've downloaded this for your PowerPoint onto your computer, then that link will be active. There's also residential funds, and so this again is part of that discretionary money, and sometimes it's necessary for an ARD committee to place a student in a residential facility. Regardless of whether you are requesting additional funds from TEA, TEA wants to see that you're doing that. So you've got that information to send. But in addition to that, if you would like to request additional funding through the residential fund application, you may do that as well. It is similar to the high cost in that you've got some criteria to meet, and it's similar in that you can ask for a certain amount, but that doesn't guarantee that you will get that amount again. There's only so much money to go around. It depends on the need and how many LEAs and that type of thing for the year. That second bullet, you will see there that it says the LEA may be awarded additional funds to supplement the 25% already set aside from the IDEA-B funds for this purpose. So that commonly is called 25% set aside. And what that means is when your tentative grant, your IDEA-B tentative grant comes in, your first amount that's awarded to you, the LEA is obligated to reserve or set aside 25% of that amount. You can pay for that amount out of federal funds, your IDEA-B funds, or you can pay for it out of your state and or local funds. But you are obligated to pay for that amount prior to requesting additional funds. Another thing that you need to keep in mind is that little bubble down there to the right. If not approved, LEAs must use local funds. So you might have your 25% amount set aside. You may have already spent that for your student or students which you are placing in a residential center. And TEA may say, sorry, we're not going to give you any additional funds, or they give you some additional funds, but it's not enough to cover the whole cost of that placement. You still have the obligation to pay for that placement. So just letting you know that. Non-public day school funds, again, are also extra money, and you can certainly apply for that. Those come in at a different setting for your PEIMS data, and so that needs to be filled out. And this is usually in your e-grants, and that's what they're talking about there where it says Consolidated Special Education Grant Application. That is what we've been talking about this whole time. So those are some other times that you would go in and make adjustments and amendments to your budget. So after you've made your adjustments and you've got your budget going, there are some auditing pieces or some monitoring pieces that you want to look at. And both the federal government and TEA are really looking at the use of federal funds, and TEA, of course, is looking at the use of state funds as well. But some things that come up, and this really mainly is probably looking more at your federal, but could apply to both, is audit findings come about more often than not in improper expenditures, so something that was expended that was not allowable under the grant. Or it could be time and effort, and for your federal grant, annual statements for federally paid employees. You might not be doing that well, or it might not be sufficient enough to show the time and effort that was charged to the grant. And just poor documentation in general causes a lot of audit findings and things that occur when you have audit findings. And also another thing that is popping up as an issue, I'll say, is a lack of written procedures for doing these various things, for budgeting, expending, and so on, and also maybe a lack of consistency for monitoring the use, expenditure of funds, and so on. So these are the big ticket items, if you will, that when auditors come in, they're looking at these pieces to make sure that there's enough documentation and that it's being done appropriately. When you spend money, your grant it's more of a reimbursement. So your expenditures are reported to TEA, again through the eGrant system, typically on a quarterly basis. And it is through WebER where you request reimbursement. So I will tell you that if some of you that run your special education programs may be frowning at that, a lot of times your special education director or people that are working directly with that budget, you put in the budget and you request expenditures, but oftentimes the actual activity of making that request through WebER, through eGrants, is done through your business office. So again, that is part of your communication with your business office folks, how that process works, when they need information, and so on. Again, we spend the money first, and then we ask for reimbursement. Be sure that when you are doing expenditures, that any expenditure for the grant and for your state budget as well is reasonable, allocable, and necessary for the implementation of your grant or your program. So they always use the 5 o'clock news example. But you don't want to be on the 5 o'clock news having people ask you, and why did you think it was necessary to buy those markers that have smell to them that cost 3 times as much as opposed to just buying regular markers? Things like that. And we did a lot of that in the face-to-face. So in those first 2 pieces, there's some information about reasonable, allocable, and necessary. And then in the compliance tab of the Live Binder is some additional information on that as well. Because things are always changing, that 3rd bullet's really warning you to make sure that you use the program and fiscal guidelines on the TEA website, also in the eGrants, for your current year. And things change from year to year. And just as a rule of thumb, when you are working with special education money, with any money actually, kind of put on your conservative approach. If you think it's a questionable expenditure, then you probably don't want to use federal funds, and I'll just even go out on a limb and say you might not even want to use state funds. So really look at your expenditures and make sure they're reasonable, make sure they're necessary, and make sure they are allowable under the special education grants. So we have that, again, just really kind of making sure that you really are being a good fiscal agent for your program. Some things to consider as well is that your funds have to benefit the current year needs. So when we get towards the end of the grant year, you should be at the end of your money as well. You don't want to wait and buy something at the very last of your grant, because that purchase, whether it's a service or whether it's materials, there's not enough time at the end of the grant, if it's a large purchase, to benefit the grant for the amount of money you're spending, if that makes sense. And so we don't want to do what a lot of people call dumping money at the end. Well, if we don't spend it, we'll lose it. Well, you should have been planning ahead of time. And again, that goes back through that whole monitoring piece that we talked about. You need to look at your actual versus your budgeted. So we talked earlier about you may need to make amendments and how that changes what you had budgeted originally to what you're actually doing. And so those pieces need to be monitored and kept in check. And then when to obligate funds. When are you allowed to say, you know, I'm going to spend this out of my 2017-18 budget, when you're allowed to do that, and keeping that in track as well. So this is an example of waiting to the last minute. So if the LEA wants to purchase new computer tablets for all staff members in June, is this an allowable expenditure? Is it reasonable? Is it necessary for the implementation of the grant? Drawing down funds, we've talked about that as well. I'm sorry, I'm going to back up there. I thought you were going to get your answers, but they didn't give you the answers. So let's just back up here. So if we're looking at your Idea B grant, which runs from July 1 through September 30th, you would want to make sure that your expenditure is allowable first, but you would also want to make sure that it occurs within that grant window, and also make sure that it's reasonable and necessary. So is it absolutely necessary for all staff members to have computer tablets? And is it necessary for what you're doing with implementing and the purpose of the grant? Another thing that I want to caution you about is that if your LEA is purchasing something for all staff, then that's really a general ed type of purchase. And so if we're purchasing it for all staff, then it ought to come out of the all staff money and not just the special ed money. So I guess might highlight that if you are a new teacher and new teachers get a certain amount of supplies and materials, if you happen to be the new special education teacher, your new supplies and materials should really be coming out of the general education fund, because everybody gets that, and not out of the special education fund. So those are some things to keep in mind. Your money from the federal grant, the way this works is that TEA is given the money from the federal government, and they put that through to the LEAs, to the ISDs and charters. The way that that occurs is that you submit your e-grant application, and then you get, there's an acronym for you, NOGA, which is Notice of Grant Award, which means that TEA has accepted your grant application, and that money is yours, and you've budgeted it appropriately. And then you would have your expenditure report. That's what we talked about with the Web ER, where you have spent the money that you have budgeted and been awarded through your NOGA. And then you request reimbursement through the expenditure report that gets sent to TEA, and then the money gets sent from TEA to the LEA. So there's a little bubble over there that says keep it simple. There's not necessarily any correct way to keep documentation, but here's what you do know. You do need to document. You should make sure that you have backups. You should make sure that folks know where your documentation is, so that if somebody were to come in and ask for that documentation and you happen to be in Hawaii or someplace nice like that, that somebody else can find that and give that information to the auditor in a very timely and seamless fashion. Again, that goes back to the communication between all areas that are going to be dealing with budget and with the special education program. There should be written processes. So if you remember, we talked about that being a piece that is often found as a audit finding, and that would be in your procedural APM, Administrative Procedures Manual. And that APM not only deals with your special education funds, but it should deal with all funds within the LEA and how that works. Who has the authority to spend funds? Who can sign that that's an approval to spend? How do we do our POs? That type of thing. Making sure that we keep any information from TEA very accessible, and making sure that we are amending our budgets, and that at some point throughout the year that our local budget and our e-grants match. And also sometimes there are emails of communication that actually come into the e-grants itself. So who's watching for those? What if TEA has a question and they've put in a question in e-grants? Who is responsible for checking that and making sure that we address those questions in a timely fashion? And then being sure that you're always reviewing your budget on a regular basis, so that at the end of the year you don't find that you're really short, or that you have really too much, or you know, that something has not been monitored well. And above all, prevent lapse funds. Make sure that you spend your money on reasonable, allowable expenditures that are necessary, and make sure that if you have any rolled over funds from the previous year, that you don't lapse those funds. Again, lapse funds and high amounts of rollover in your federal grants raise some red flags, and raise some flags as to how effective not only are your budgeting practices, but also raise some flags as to how well is your program functioning. So just keep that in mind. And I hope we're not scaring you. Budgeting is not the most cheery subject. So this again is just talking about what I just said, your lapse funds and your large rollover, and those little sub-bullets under that second bullet you can read on your own. Those are some things, those are the red flags that are being thrown up when you have large amounts of rollover or when you have lapse funds. We already talked about high cost, the final bullet on that screen, and we already talked about how when you have lapse funds, it looks a little odd that you lapse funds, you don't spend them all, and yet you're asking for more. So that's why you may be decided, your LEA may be ineligible for that high cost discretionary funds. Another thing to keep in mind, we often have contracted service providers, and something that the IRS has really started to scrutinize over the years is, just because you're calling somebody a contracted service provider doesn't mean they look more like an employee in the methods of which we're using. So this slide and the next slide give you some questions to ask, and if you're answering yes to a lot of them, then your contracted service provider looks more like an employee and would have to have employee things like benefits and so on. And so the little red bubble over there says make sure you discuss with your business officers and your human resources office to determine and to assure, I should say, that your contracted service providers are indeed functioning as such and don't look like employees. So there's a little note in the notes of your PowerPoint slide that if you answer yes to any of the 5 through 20, it means your worker is probably an employee. But it does warn you not to panic and to discuss this with the business office and the HR office. In particular, those first 4, instructions, training, integration, and services rendered personally, are kind of the key of these 20 things. So I will tell you instructions. Just as a rule of thumb, the more control you have over a contracted service provider, the more they look like an employee. So if you're telling your contracted service provider about when and where and how they can do the services, that starts to look more like an employee. You have contracted somebody and you are really looking for the end result and not necessarily how they got there. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Of course you want them to be compliant and meet timelines and things like that, but in general you look at the end result and not necessarily how they get there. Training, you should be not training these people because they're supposed to already be trained and fulfill a need for you. So that, again, is a question that comes up. And integration. Is this person that you're contracting with so important that your program would fall apart or really be in desperate need if you didn't have them there? Well, if that's the case, then really they look more like an employee than somebody that you're contracting with. Services rendered personally. So does the person that you're contracting with, do they have to provide all the services? Or have you said, this is what I need, and they have the freedom to hire other people or work with other colleagues that they have in their offices to get the job done? If they can do that, then they look more like a contracted person. If you're saying, nope, it's just you and nobody else, now it looks more like an employee. So hiring assistance kind of goes in there as well. That would be the contracted service provider that would be doing the hiring assistance and not the LEA. Otherwise, it looks more like an employee. What kind of relationship do you have? Is it something that, oh yeah, we do that all the time, every year? So that throws up a red flag as to perhaps they are more looking like an employee than a contracted person. And what about work hours? If the contract does not allow for your contracted service provider to work other places, other jobs, then they're going to look more like an employee as well, because most contracted service providers have multiple people that they work with, multiple entities, and things like that. Same with the full-time work and work done on the premise. Again, the more the LEA controls the contracted service providers' activities to provide the service or training or assistance, the more they look like an employee and not a contracted service provider. So we've got their 14 sequence. Are you determining the order in which the activities are done to get the end product, or is that left to the contractor? The contracted service provider should have the flexibility of being able to do it in the order that they want and not the LEA. And must the worker give you reports accounting for his or her actions? Again, that looks like a lack of independence. Please don't misunderstand that. Certainly if you are hiring somebody to provide a service such as speech service or something like that, yes, you want to make sure that those were done and you do want to keep records for that. But they're just talking overall. And pay schedules. So typically when you have a contracted service provider or someone that's being contracted, they're typically paid by the job and not by the hour, week, or month. Just because you pay by the hour, week, or month doesn't mean you've now moved into the employee realm, but that's just sort of a rule of thumb. They're typically paid by the job. But again, talk with your business office and your HR office because some of our service providers, if they're working, student services, things like that, you may have that by the hour or whatever. But again, don't panic. They're just things to consider. And if you start seeing a lot of yeses on this, that is something to double check with your business office or your HR office and kind of work through that. Do you pay for their travel expenses? Do you pay for their tools and materials? If you're paying for those types of things, then again, they're going to look more like an employee because your contracted independent contractor would have their own tools and would do their own travel. Right to fire. Can you fire this person? Well, if they're under a contract, that would be a breach of contract on your part. And if they quit, that would be a breach of contract on their part. Your contract should have a way that you can end contracts, and certainly if they're not fulfilling the information in the contract, that would be a reason not to contract with them next time. But fire and quit are kind of terms that are used for employees. So be aware that the IRS is really looking at things like that. Here are some other bullets to consider. And just know that they are a guide on the IRS webpage. There's information about this as well. And just know that the more control you have over a contracted service provider or an independent contractor, the more it looks like they're an employee and not contracted. And do discuss this with your business office and HR office. It is an area that has become under scrutiny, I'll say, recently. We are not going to do the chapter summary, action plan, and resources PowerPoint. So let me escape out of this. You can go there. It's kind of it gives you some questions and answers that you can look at. And it is right here under the Budget Building Parts 8 and 9 tab. We are going to look at, we're not going to look at Budget Action Plan building either. Let me flip my page here. So we're going to skip this one as well. We are going to look at budget coding process. So if you will download that, I will click to where I already have that. And hopefully it will load a little bit faster. There we go. And in this PowerPoint, we're going to look at coding. We're going to look at accounts, allowables, and movement. So typically, if you've been with us before, the budget planning PowerPoints, the three that are at the very beginning in that tab, typically they did not start with your key terms, but most of your PowerPoints in the funding binder start with not only your objectives for that particular one, but also some key terms. And so here are some things that we're going to look at. We talked about this just a little bit at the beginning of our webinar. We talked about this is your big long line for expending things and what all those numbers mean. And one of those is your account code, so it will tell you your fund code, so it will tell you whether it's federal or state. Function code, who is using it. We have object code, what you're buying it for. Your org code, where it's being used on, elementary or high school. Program intent code, we discussed that earlier. For special education, it's 23 or 33. And then we have some sub-object codes as well that are optional. So here's what this looks like. And this is from your Financial Accountability Systems Resource Guide. Some people call it the FASREG, some people call it the FASRUG, whatever. It's FASRG is how you usually see that, okay? And it does tell you that LEAs will determine what order that these codes go in, but each of these sections needs to be represented in your coding structure. So there you go. There's the FASREG here. Down here is your acronym. So this is what it looks like in the FASREG. And just so that you know, you have three here that have these little dashes. This one here says local option code 1 and 2, local option code 3, and local option code 4. So these three pieces are not necessary, but you would find using them is very beneficial. So I'll give you some examples. We talked about proportionate share. Proportionate share is the obligation of an ISD, and this time I am separating ISDs and charters. So it's the obligation of an ISD to spend a proportion of their money on students that are students that are eligible for special ed services, but they have been placed by their parents either in a home school or a nonprofit private school. And so you can track what money you're expending on your proportionate share by using a local option code. Please don't misunderstand that that means I put whatever code I want to in there. That would be a coordination between your business office and yourself. But here we've got your fund codes, function codes, objects, and then we've got your org codes, fiscal year, program intent, and then you've got the other three. This is the same information, but it's in a little bit easier to read chart. And if you remember, we looked at that 4-page kind of program guidelines. This is the chart that was on that guidelines. So the fund code is which fund it's coming from, and you'll see down at the bottom of the chart there, 199 is your state and or local. For charter schools, that's typically 420 instead of 199. And then you have your 224, which is your IDEA B, and your 225, which is your preschool. So those 200 codes there are your federal grant. Then the fiscal year, so this would be 2011-12, because if you remember, it's the last digit of the last school year. So the 2 there would indicate to me that this would have been from the 2011-12 school year. Who's using it, what function, so 11 instruction, that type of thing. And there are codes in the FAS reg about that as well, defining all those for you. Your org code, where is it being used, high school, elementary, central office, where. And then your program intent. And in this chart, it is aptly has 23 there, which means special ed, 0 to 21, and then your 33 is the 3 to 5-year-olds. Budget manager, so that would be a locally assigned number there as to who can sign off, and then your object code. So your 6100s are typically personnel, 6200s are typically contracted services, 6300s are typically supplies and materials, and so on. And there you have some examples there on the last column for some of those optional sub-object codes that are used for tracking. If we have money coming in or money going out that is a specific purchase or purpose, and so that is what that's for. You can see there PS, the last one there is probably proportionate share. It's a nice way to track those things. So let's go into this in a little more detail. Our fund code. So what is the fund source? And there you go. We've got that for special education. You're going to use either 199, 224, or 225. You see there the last bullet there addresses the charters. The only difference is that 199, which is state and local for ISD, is 420 for charters. Then we also have times when LEAs will combine together in a shared service arrangement, and when that is being done, then they've got some different fund codes that they use, and that's your middle bullet there, 437, 313, and 314. So one of the LEAs that's involved in the shared service arrangement is considered the fiscal agent of that, and they have some additional reporting that they should do for their member districts. I will tell you that there is a shared service arrangement information in the funding binder, and that will be covered at a later date in another webinar. We've already talked about the fiscal year, so here you go where they've got 2010-11. The fiscal year code would be 1, and you've got that going down there through. So there you see 2011-12, the 2 is for that year. And then function. What is the purpose of the funds being expended? And so these are some of your more commonly used, 11 for instruction, 13 staff development, and so on. And that would be in your funding code line as well. Organization, so where are the funds going to? And there you've got your typical ones there as well, including the 999 undistributed, meaning, you know, sort of district-wide, charter-wide. We don't know in what specific area. But that also is part of your fund code. Program intent, we talked about that as well. There you've got the 2 special education codes in the middle there, 23 and 33. They also reference basic education 11 and then undistributed 99. Program intent is often referred to PIT codes, so you might hear that term used. Then budget management. This we talked about is that, you know, defined by the LEA. It is who has the responsibility for making sure, allowing that the money can indeed be expended. And so it varies by LEA. Again, that would be something for your business office to talk to about. Account code. So this is for what is the money being spent. We've already talked about this. 6100 payroll, $6,200. And your payroll also includes, by the way, stipends and benefits and TRS payments. So all of those would be in the 6,100s. Then you've got your professional and contracted services and ESC and utilities and things like that in your 6,200s. 6,300s are your supplies and materials. 6,400 is your other operating expenses. 65 debt services, and 6,600 is your capital outlay. We'll give you a little bit of additional information on your capital outlay there. You see the little asterisk by 5,000. We often hear the you can do more but you can't do less when we're talking about guidance and federal and state law and things like that. So typically anything that is above 5,000 and has a lifetime of more than a year, and there's some other qualifications there, is considered capital outlay and would have some sort of object code 6600 series. But an LEA can also put in a cap, if you will, for capital outlay. Now they can't make that more money, they can make it less. So they're doing more in that they're becoming more restrictive. And so that's what that asterisk is for, is to give you a caution that you need to check with your current policies to see if you have a lower threshold for that capital outlay piece. You have sub-object codes and optional object codes, and so those can help you track more closely how this money is spent. Again, we've used proportionate share as an example and things like that. Those are very helpful, especially when you have to do reports on particular expenditures and things like that. Again, this is something that those of us over the special education program would not necessarily assign what it looks like, but it would be something that we would talk to the business office about. You know, I need to be able to pull this out very easily out of my expenditure reports. What can we use in one of the sub object codes or the optional codes in order to be able to pull that easily? So when you are doing budgeting and codes, you need to make sure that your expenditures are, of course, allowable and not unallowable for both state and federal. You need to look at previous budgets so that you can compare from previous years and project for the current year. You need to keep the funding pyramid in mind. We looked at that on that very first handout. So we need to make sure that we are not supplanting and things like that. The FAS reg, of course, gives us detail, so it goes into great detail about object codes, function codes, funding codes, and also gives information about allowable and unallowable as well, as do your guides that are in eGrant. And then, of course, always check with your business office, being sure that some of those optional codes, if they're being used, that you're using them correctly, and so on. When you go in and apply for your eGrant itself, you won't be doing detail. You'll just be doing major. So you're not going to be doing 6114 and so on. You'll be doing 6100 and doing a big kind of bulk type of budgeting, if you will. There is a sample grant, and there's actually a tab in the live binder, and I believe it's called eGrant application. There's a sample grant in there. There's also a sample grant on the TEA Grant Opportunities webpage, and then we also will go over eGrant application. But you're already in the year, you've already done an eGrant application, so we'll review that information as we get towards the end of this year and before the beginning of next year. Again, we're talking about being able to move up to 25% of your total grant without doing an amendment. And we talked earlier about there are some exceptions to that. And so some exceptions to that are those things that no matter how much you're moving require specific approval from TEA. Please understand this is in your eGrants application, and also please understand that sometimes this changing in your budget, whether federal or state, requires approval from your board or other members. So check with your policies as well. but certainly these are required amendments in your e-grant required for you to go into your e-grants and amend from TEA. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So all staff positions, any pre-populated costs, non-capitalized technology, pre-populated items in the 6,400, anything that's in 65, that's your debt services, and 6,600, that's your capital outlay. And then we talked very early on in this webinar about your coordinated early intervening services funds, your CEIS funds. Any of those also need prior approval. We have a chapter review here, and this is kind of talking about supplement versus supplant. So can you use federal funds to pay for routine classroom supplies? The key there is routine. If it's routine, then we're saying it's everybody. And if it's everybody, then it comes out of the everybody fund. It certainly doesn't come out of the special ed federal funds or the special ed state funds. It should be an all fund type of thing. Can you use federal funds to pay for an occupational therapist to provide IEP supports? So there again, you've got somebody who's working on providing something that is critical to a student. It's in their IEP. Certainly it is a reasonable cost because that is something the student needs, and it would be something that would be supporting the program. So yes. Can you use federal dollars to pay for tips when traveling? So I will just read this to you because I find this kind of interesting. It says, as per the U.S. General Services Administration per diem FAQ, tips can be included in meals and an incidental cost rate. But I would caution you there to go to that website that is in your notes on the PowerPoint. It's the gsa.gov, and read more about that. I think probably most people do not put that in there, but not sure. That's a local decision, and make sure that you follow the guidance on that. Just keep in mind when we're talking about funds, especially public school funds, especially federal funds for public school activities, that we want to be good fiscal agents, and we want to always keep our conservative hat on, and keep in mind allowable, reasonable, necessary, and keep in mind that just because you can doesn't mean you should. So just kind of cautions for you, but again, that is an LEA decision, and make sure that you follow the guidance that's on that website that's in the notes section of this particular slide. Can you carry over 100% of your federal funds to the next school year? Well, for your IDEA funds, for your special education funds, yes, indeedy, you can, and yes, indeedy, it's not the best thing to do and throws up all kinds of red flags. Can you register for a conference with the 13-14 federal funds for a conference in October of 14? Well, we talked about, there's a schedule there about your grant year. So your federal grant ends September 30th, which means no, because you're taking your 13-14 money to pay for something in your grant year of 14-15. Can you split fund the cost of paying for a staff development speaker with another department using federal funds? So this is the typical answer to all things special ed. It depends. If the presenter is speaking solely on a special education issue, then yes, you can. But if they're speaking half the topic, half the day on special ed and then half on general ed, then no, you can't. So that's another thing to kind of think about. And then the account code 199, or I'll just say for the charter folks, the account code 420 is always used for federal funds, true or false. That's a definite false because that is your state and local, or for charters, your state. So here's just sort of a summary of your funds and your coding. Some action steps to think about, and just cannot emphasize enough that number 2, coordinating with your LEA business office with lots of things, not just with optional codes, but lots of other things as well. And also always review your expenditures. Make sure you're coding this right. Make sure that it's something that's allowable, reasonable, and necessary. And then after the service or material has come in, make sure that it's exactly what you ordered, what you were paying for, what you were contracted with, and so on. All right, so it is 2:14, and we are back at our Special Education Funding Live Binder. If you click on the coding structure, there's two of them. So this is the one that's the easier one to read. It's also the one that's the smaller version on that first tab there, Budget and Quick Reference. And then you also have as a full slide on that one from the FASREG, Financial Accountability System Resource Guide. So both of those are there. We've already talked about the timelines, and so here you go. This is also a smaller version on that 4-page document at the beginning, but here is a nice big chart for you. And then sample budget flow chart. This is just kind of steps for you to keep in mind as you are budgeting. So this is the beginning, and then this is throughout, and then always, always, always monitor. We've referenced the funding pyramid, and this is it here, and it talks about your MOE, it talks about the 52% for your state, talked about that as well, your CEIS funds here and your federal, and it's just showing you what these various pieces are for. This is a nice review chart that you might want to download and or print out. So it kind of gives you a very brief description of some of the things, and it splits them in between federal and state, and then some other expenditures. It's a really nice recap, and it talks about various things like your 15% set, your 25% set aside, your 15% CEIS, and so on. So that's a nice handy chart that you might want to look at. The budget, idea budget template. Is an Excel spreadsheet. It's editable. So the one that's in the live binder has some previous year information in it. But this is a nice spreadsheet to look at. And so what you have here, you would, need to change these, of course. But this is looking at more detail. So where we talked about the 6100s, now you can see in this on row 8, column A, 6112 is substitutes, 6117 extra duty pay, 6119 salaries, and so on. This gives you, in column C, that would be what you would have originally budgeted for. We talked about the e-grants application, so you would look at 6100, that would be, a total there, but then this is the more detailed breakdown of what that is. And then you have some things here where you may have done an amendment. It says amendment number 1, so if you all are facile with Excel, you could do amendment 2, amendment 3, and track your various changes. And then this here is what you have actually expended. And part of the slides showed before, making sure that your budgeted and your actual are reconciled. So this is a good way to keep up. What did I originally say I was going to spend? Where did I make my amendments? And then in the end, what did I really actually spend? This helps not only monitor your current year, so for this example it'd be the 14-15 school year, but it also gives you some help for when you get ready for your next budget, because there may have been places where you really spiked in your predictions. There may have been places that, gee, I had budgeted this amount and I didn't spend anywhere near that amount. And so it kind of gives you some guidance there as to changes for your next year, which there you go, that's the last column. What you might want for your initial budgeting projections or ideas for the next school year. So that's a nice way to keep up with that. And of course you enter in various other pieces here. These are just samples. And then they've got some reminders and things like this. So you have here, they apparently, when they did the proportionate share, they offered speech services, and they also did CEIS services. Again, this is part of where you're going to be tracking this information This is going to be part where in that budgeting code you might want to get with your business office to talk about some of those optional codes so that when you pull the data from your expenditure reports and things like that, you can get that information easily to track for that line here. Okay, so they've got some examples, and down at the bottom they've got some reminders for the different fund codes and object codes. The second tab looks very much like the first tab. It's just that it's for your preschool, your 224 federal funds. And of course you can adapt this and use it for state funds and so on. And it's just a really nice tool. I'm going to close that. And it takes us back to our funding binder. So we're going to stop with this. We're ending a little bit early, but it's difficult to sit in a webinar that's long, and this has been going on for quite some time. The next one that we will do is our fiscal compliance. I'll just kind of give you a preview, a teaser. I know y'all are just waiting with bated breath for this one. It has lots and lots of information, and we'll talk about not only federal but also some state compliance. We'll talk about excess cost, and there's a template in here on how to do that. We'll talk about some things that are required, such as inventory management and how to get rid of some equipment, disposition of equipment. And we'll also talk about maintenance of effort and some other things. So look forward for that. Our next webinar is scheduled for January 30th, and so it will be at the same time. And hopefully that will be on our website where you can register, and then you'll get the link sent out to you. And then later on, this is to be determined as to how this will roll out. There's your shared services arrangement and your proportionate share. So we typically do those together, and then typically throw in financial records as well. But you also have the e-grants application. So that's what we were talking about for perhaps one of the later ones. So these might shift out. Before we go, I do want to show you, for those of you that do proportionate share, some people are not aware of this. There is, in the proportionate share tab, sample forms and sample operating guidelines, all different types of things. So we'll look at that in a little more detail when we get there. Here's a TEA calendar. You have some links and resources here that cover just a variety of information. There are not any webinars that go over that, but that is information for you to access. And then you have some other things here, including other webinars, just in case you didn't get enough with this one. So anyway, you've got some additional resources there. So I want to thank you again very much for your participation. We will get this posted hopefully within the next 2 weeks, if not before. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, Karen, Karen, .slaughter, SLAUGHTER, at region10, that's region10.org, or my direct line is 972-348-1690. Also, Anna Griffiths is here, so I'd like to thank Anna for helping me with this webinar. And that is it. We hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for being with us.